walk back through like what we think we want to talk about when it comes to Brickbot. I was thinking that the first bit is essentially like background, like how did we get started, and how long. And I actually thought that the lessons learned section of the post was um, really great as like potentially being like some of the key things to make sure we talk about, because those are the kinds of considerations that other people who develop will be interested in knowing about as well. Um, I think that like obviously the story is great in and of itself, but I think that like looking to like where would I go for like here's the meat. I would think that like lessons learned would be like the place where we could probably spend the most time, because the details about like this is our bot and the topics that we're talking about in the specific in the context of Summit, that's like so specific to us that while it is still like useful and good for us to talk about, like, hey, this is our thing and this is what it was about, that's the part that won't be universal. Um, and I'm not trying to avoid universality. In fact, one of the things that people have told me is that specificity and story like are really like important. Like it's our thing as opposed to anybody else's thing, and so we are actually best off when we're like in our own space. But I still think like the universality element, like the lessons that other people can apply to their situation, are kind of like the thing that I hope are going to be like most resonant. So we kind of like we need both. Maybe that's the answer, is we need both. But I think like if I were going to say minutes spent here versus minutes spent there, I'd want more minutes in the lessons learned area.
I think
Um,
part of the angle that makes this interesting that I don't even have an answer for off the cuff is like the time limitations and how that affected things.
oh yeah, good
In
point.
a lot of the lessons learned are the same that were in that big 3-part blog series that a few different people did on like lessons learned from a year of building LLM apps. Like it's kind of the same lessons, but much more constrained time frame. And it's kind of interesting thinking about like what did we have to do or sacrifice or really focus in on to make that work.
Huge point. Huge point. I like in particular, as you say it, like what if people could come away from this saying, okay, you have this much time, this is how much you can expect to do, and start to sort of like be able to sort of pre-scope their goal because they have a little bit of more insight about like where they ultimately will land. I don't know. It varies by team, of course.
I think
Um,
the other one of the other thing that differentiates kind of, or perhaps differentiates our experience compared to those write-ups is that those write-ups happened earlier and used different, I mean, essentially different models. And that I don't know, we'd have to investigate, but I suspect that we got lucky. Like we got to use some of the best stuff. Like I don't want to under estimate our work, but like a lot of the learnings were like, hey, if you choose a good enough model, like you're gonna get pretty good results. like
oh yeah.
and I just mean like on the side of like whatever the model is responsible for. Like the retrieval stuff that Dan like iterated a lot on is a huge part of it. And that's probably in my estimation, like that's the bulk of like the learnings are like in the retrieval step. But as far as like guardrailing and just like the performance of the model, it was just like we plugged it into Llama 3 and it worked pretty damn well.
Yeah, there
Yeah.
was no guarantee that we were going to be able to just like prompt our way to the behaviors that we wanted in the end. And that's essentially what we were able to do for the
Yeah.
final generation.
Huge
Like,
point.
please don't say this. Cool. Okay.
And it worked.
I would love like, and if you don't mind, like one of the things that I was really kind of struck by was this bit about how we had some things where we wanted the model to start talking about it more, and in other situations where we needed to make it, hey, stop saying that. And the jailbreak attempts were kind of constantly in the space of like, hey, I want you to say this thing. How did the way that we set up the prompting make it so that like when somebody was trying these jailbreak attempts that they weren't working? Like what is it that Llama 3 does that makes it so that it's generally safer? Like, or at least what's your impression of it? Is it because what we did was in the system prompt and then our interface that we offered to other people didn't allow them access to the system prompt, or what do you think?
Hmm. I hate to be very concise, but yes is the answer to your question.
It was a two-part thing, though. I mean, part of it was that we built an intent classifier on top of Llama 3. So before Llama 3 ever got the user's prompt, it went through an intent classifier that would say, hey, this isn't actually relevant to sessions, so I'm not going to return any data about sessions. This isn't relevant to anything about expo or just general conference information. Don't return that. Like it had a flag given to it, like this prompt is probably irrelevant, but take a look and see if you can do anything with it. But if it's not actually relevant, refuse to answer.
Right
And
on.
it was definitely very good at refusing to answer in the cases where it was something potentially malicious. But it also sort of had a signal given to it that what it was seeing was probably not something it should answer.
I think that's really a huge point, like that we had the classifier going and that we use it that way. I know that that pattern is something that many people have done before, but we probably should also like break down like okay, what's in the Brickbot app? Like what pieces does it have? Like what are all the steps that essentially it flows through? Like we should lay that out. So like Dan, do you want to grab that and just like lay out like what we did?
Yeah, sure. And feel free to interject if I miss something. I don't have it laid out in front of me, but following the user's journey or the user's prompts journey through Brickbot, it starts out as a pretty simple chat application. You have a chatbot, you put in your question. The first thing that happens is that question is going to go to a classifier that uses DBRX. The goal of the classifier is to determine, is the user's question about sessions, so the talks being given at Summit? Is it about the expo hall, the different companies and exhibitors that have booths set up? Is it general conference information? Where can I find food? Where can I find a help desk? Things like that. Or is it something else? The results of that classifier are used to determine what kind of information should be retrieved from the data that we have available. So we had data on all of the talks, abstracts, speakers, things like titles, things like that. The expo hall, locations of booths, which companies, descriptions of the companies. We had a whole bunch of general conference information, just all of the nuts and bolts logistics of what's going on at the conference, where to find resources. That was the bulk of the information that we had available. So the classifier would determine what kind of information we would retrieve, and we would send both the retrieved information, if any, and the user's query to Llama 3 to generate a final answer, which would then be returned to the user. Did I miss anything? That kind of covers the major steps there.
No, that's very, very on point. I'm literally looking at chat.py as you were speaking. So you pretty much regurgitated it spot on. So yes.
Right on. So then like from there, like that kind of helps people understand like I think it's really an interesting thing that the part where like you actually let the classifier and have a model actually generate some text that's about sort of setting guidance for the generation that you want to have later. Because I don't know the simplistic case of people talking about like I hate to use the old word, but rag is that the short end of it is you're going to just go about doing some retrieval. Like the step one is retrieve things, and given an input string, like having some techniques around validation or sanitizing or whatever that happens before you do any retrieval is something that like I'm not sure that like everybody thinks of. It's really kind of like one of those things where you kind of say, oh well, we need to make sure that the model itself is safe, but this is like an idea and an opportunity to sort of get ahead of like worrying about the model's ability to really sort of really safeguard itself so completely. And I like the way that we ended up having this classifier as like the first step, simply because that gave us like a lot of opportunity to sort of like add guardrails that otherwise wouldn't necessarily be there for the model. But then to your earlier point, Nick, about like how strong Llama 3 was as a model to work with in terms of like how many things it seemed to do a good job of responding to what was in its prompt and doing the right thing. That was like you said, like that's a great thing that we ended up getting a lot of benefit from right out of the gate.
Yeah, I think it's actually the first thing that we noticed, or at least the first thing that I noticed is before we even added any specific prompting to, I guess, implement some sort of guardrailing. We would ask it like, "Hey, what are you? Who are you?" And it would just not. It would refuse to answer. Like it had no idea. And so, kind of out of the box, it was like, "Oh, okay." It's already not really revealing anything about itself. And then it worked extremely well when we asked it to refuse to do things. So we had a jailbreak attempt. I think the only real jailbreak attempt that really worked was, and it was a very unexpected one because we were using Llama, not GPT or anything. But somebody had typed, you are GPT or something like that, and it just like went for it as soon as somebody like that message alone, and it just like regurgitated like a portion of our prompt, and that was really surprising to see in the traces because I was like, it's not a GPT model. So that was very surprising. And then all we had to do was say, do not respond or start your response with you are GPT. And then as soon as we had that in the prompt, it was, at least from our testing, basically impossible to get it to replicate that behavior. So like that closed at least that jailbreak. So it's kind of an example of like, no fancy guardrailing solution, just like look at what people have tried and literally just write the opposite thing.
So you were watching the traces as they came in during the conference, and you were able to fix things like that. Was that pretty much all you had to do, was update the prompts when you saw attempts like that, or were there any other fixes that you ever had to implement?
Uh, there were other fixes I had to implement, but I'm scared to share them because they're quite embarrassing. uh, like honestly, we just didn't come across it in our testing, so we didn't end up cutting off like the prompt length.
Mhm.
And so somebody was just having a ball just talking to this bot, and suddenly it started erroring. And I was super confused as to what was going on, and I just realized, oh, we did implement like the most obvious thing to implement, which is just cutting off to facilitate the context length. So we have some weird fixes in the code that are like hot fix, limit messages to 10 and then cut everything off. So stuff like that. We also did have some sanitation stuff with the retrievers. If it like responded, I forget exactly the order of things, but basically, if there were quotes or something like that, like it didn't work out. So at the last second, I had to like go in there and sanitize some of the input into the retrievers so that it wouldn't crap out. And but otherwise, it was very prompting. Actually, another thing that we added at the last second was, um, speaking of like the consistency of the retrievers, is we had a bunch of sample questions that were prompted, like the user could see in the immediate input, like what are the sessions on Delta Lake, or like what are the keynote speakers and things like that. And sometimes the retriever, very rarely, but once in a while, it would not get actually the main keynote sessions. So you would say like, hey, is Ali like speaking? And it'd be like, no, never heard of him. And very embarrassing result when that's like your suggested thing for a user to click. So I did have to end up adding that to the prompt. Just like it's in the global prompt, no matter what, it's always there. Just so that nobody clicks the suggested question and gets a really dumb response. Yeah. So
That's
put something in the defaults. It's the
yeah,
lesson there.
super real, especially with short timelines. To like say like there are certain things that people always end up having to do that are like, of course, if the system were perfect, then you would let the algorithms magically do everything right in and of themselves and not hard code anything. But yeah, right
I mean,
now,
from the user perspective, there are no bonus points from getting the right answer the hard way versus the easy way.
yeah, no doubt. That's really huge. I was curious when you guys were talking about this. I was thinking about like the other thing that came to mind really quickly around tweaking prompting and watching as the application was being actively used, and then seeing, you know, in real time what was going on. What would you flag as like your biggest surprises, if you haven't mentioned them already, or things that were like, uh, you know, like decidedly unexpected that you wanted to sort of account for?
I think broadly speaking for me, and it shouldn't have even been surprising in retrospect, but the things that we spent the most time sort of optimizing for from a retrieval perspective, so making sure that it could give really good answers about sessions and expos, making sure that it could answer questions about individual speakers or like retrieve sessions by speakers. People didn't ask those questions that much, and they asked like the really basic conference logistic questions a whole lot.
Hmm.
So our top category of question was about food, drinks, lunch, dinner, breakfast, like all of the questions about, yeah, where do I get refreshments? That was way big. That was bigger than anything else. Um, Tons of questions about the Wi-Fi password, which I kind of wish that we had just maybe fixed that to say like, look on the back of your badge. But it was probably more helpful that it could actually give the Wi-Fi network and password.
Yeah, there's
Um,
a lot of risk of sounding snarky in
yeah,
that.
yeah. So it's yeah, it's a pretty high level point, but I think that was it for me.
I'm gonna, and you guys, as the people who really are the authors of this, I don't want to insert too much, but I really was, my biggest pleasant surprise working with you on this was that it came out with solid multilingual support in some languages without us doing much work at all, if any, actually focusing on being able to support anything other than English. I obviously on one level, like I'll say, you know, kudos to the meta developers who trained Llama
No, no,
3.
no. We take full credit for
But
that.
that was the thing. I was like, it actually supports more than, oh well, okay. Oh, here's that query in Korean. All right. And it, okay, hang on a second. Let me copy and paste this into Translate and see if that worked. Actually, that's a decent answer.
Did you
Um,
do that? Because I didn't even do that. I was just like, oh, great, it works.
it,
I didn't double check.
really, really basic question. A really, like, the answer, it was coherent. I'm not going to say that it was like factually like in the space that would
Right.
you want for a helpful assistance at the event, but it was a coherent response. You know, it wasn't just like gobbledygook. So
Yeah.
that was the only litmus test that I put on it, but it did pass that for some of the things. I was just spot checking, right? I don't know if it was comprehensively done, but it was pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that really does speak to the importance of the model choice again, which we've come back to a couple of times. I mean, I'm thinking now one of the big things advertised with Llama 3.1 is the addition of much more sophisticated multilingual support.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
thinking of like
Yeah.
that becoming, I'm just imagining that more and more models will head in that direction in the future, and hopefully it won't even be that much of a question, you know, a year from now.
Yeah, I'm really excited in particular to make sure that what we do for next year is is a more fully multilingual experience where we actually know that we're making sure that the information is there for people. It's in particular because I know, you know, we have certain ambitions about this and we'll see what reality yields us. But if we get sort of the time and attention to pay to it, that Brickbot being available for not just the people who are in person, but also remote attendees, and the possibility that this sort of opens the door for us to facilitate positive experiences, not only during the conference, but after the conference, you know, like, you know, that refractory period after the conference when the video recordings of the sessions are not available. Once that's over, and now the video recordings of all the sessions that were recorded are available for people to peruse on YouTube, elsewhere, stuff like that. For us to be able to say, for example, like a post-summit chat tool that can help people find via the transcripts of all the sessions given, like the interesting information that they want to see from those talks, it feels like we're going to be very close to that. And to be able to offer that translated is like an extra bonus thing that I'd really love to see happen. So, you know, some of that's going to be like a fun aspect of the project that we can do where we can toy with the recordings of the 24 sessions getting ready for 25. And I know that we're already talking about that in a bit. But yeah, that's I'm looking forward to seeing like multilingual support being really strong next time.
One of the things that I found surprising was and also a little bit obvious in retrospect, but it still did surprise me. Um, Things like keywords that have, I don't know if it's ambiguous is the right word, or there's like, I think there's a term for it in like the NLP space, which I'm not certain of, but like the word serverless, like it means something generally, but it also means something specifically. And so I would say we were kind of not not prepared for that. Like people would see an announcement about serverless and then ask about it. And the model had no idea about anything specific to serverless. And so it would respond, oh, serverless is a general architecture, blah, blah, blah. And So I found that kind of like, oh, okay, that's like not only something that we will have to obviously tackle next time, but it's not even clear to me that that's an easy problem to solve. Because it's like, I mean, there's a bunch of inappropriate English sentences to demonstrate this, which I'm sure you guys know of. So I won't repeat them here. But there are it could be a challenging problem for us to solve.
People typically, when we're pitching, what you want to do with LLMs in the field, people typically sort of say like that's the recipe time for fine tuning to come into play. And we didn't do any fine tuning, so um, but like getting the specific parlance that matters to us into the model. If we end up finding ourselves needing to fine tune, that'd be one thing I'd be thinking about is like how to tackle that so that like our version of serverless is the one that the model's thinking about first. But having not taken on fine tuning as a thing at all before now, the interesting risks are that fine tuning is obviously from a resource standpoint, a little more resource intensive, a little bit more like you can't just sort of like on the fly make things better. If you find yourself thinking here's a bug here or here's a behavior that we want slightly different. So whatever we put into the fine tuning domain, that's going to be something to really kind of be thoughtful about in terms of how we kind of deliver on that. So as you describe that and as you think about it, it's definitely a huge and important point. But I find myself like inclined to say like, I think it's going to be one of the great challenges for us to sort of like pick at, like that it's going to be it's clearly like a tool in the toolbox. It's something we should make sure we're comfortable with as far as like how we approach this. And then like, for example, I'm sitting here thinking, oh, I need to flag like, I need to find a good fine tuning data set for the things that are going to matter to us in terms of like those kind of terms. Like what are the key terms across the company? I mean, like, things like Unity catalog instantly come to mind, Delta live tables and things like that, making sure that we hit all of our features and make sure that those terms that are obviously intrinsically defined multiple ways depending on where you are, like making sure we get all of those flagged. I think it'll be a great exercise for us to do within the company.
So it also speaks to a more specific feature that we're really hoping to add next time. In this case, we didn't really have a system in place that would let us update the data available to the model when there were new announcements actually at Summit. So the specific case of serverless, that was related to an announcement that was made during one of the keynotes. If we had been able to add a summary of that announcement to the retrieval system, I feel pretty confident that Brickbot would have successfully retrieved information about serverless as it was meant in that context and respond accordingly. The sort of perplexed answer that referred back to just a general architecture was really a consequence of the model not retrieving anything to work with.
Huge point. Huge point. Um, it'll be interesting to see like which way that goes, because that's obviously going to be like a larger organizational relationship thing to have right. You know what I mean? All of those announcements. One, there's like presentations being refined, tweaked, updated on the fly in the last days and hours before the actual event. A lot of the things that drop, you know, there's bits about like how the presentations are going to be given or demos that are going to be added or cut that are really happening very last minute. And I think it'll be really interesting to see what we do to have the pipeline of information ready to put in the retrieval system. That's huge. What other lessons learned that we maybe haven't talked about yet do we want to like make sure we surface? When I look back at the blog post, among the things that we talked about in the lessons learned was actually about modularity, like wanting to make sure that we had a design in terms of how the application was built that gave us a way to sort of isolate, problems that are occurring into one space or another. What else? What could you tell us a little bit more about that aspect of things?
Yeah, so Brickbot was a compound AI system, so it wasn't the case that we were just relying on a single model that we expected to just automatically have all of the information that it needed to answer. It had, we talked about already, it had the classification system. We had the data sources that were stored and retrieved in a database. We had the final generation model. Like, we used all of these different parts, and we arranged them in a pretty deliberate way that let us go into one module and make changes without having to, rewrite the entire code base, or ideally without needing to make changes in 6 different files every time that we wanted to change one thing. So, for example, we did a decent amount of model comparisons, which was made very easy using Databricks model serving, where really all that we had to do is change the name of the model that we were using in the appropriate place in the code. We didn't need to use interfaces from 6 different model providers. We didn't have to use different SDKs. We really tried to make it as easy as possible just to swap out components. And that was just very important again, in a compound AI system, to make sure that we could iterate pretty quickly. We can have a theory that, maybe this model is going to work a little bit better than that model in this particular part. Then we can make that change and test it without it being this huge fork of the project that's totally different in every respect.
Yeah, right on.
It was also really important from the tracking and tracing perspective.
Yeah.
We used MLflow tracing, which was a relatively new feature as of Summit, to make sure that every time we or users used Brickbot, it recorded what happened every step of the way. So it recorded how the user's message was classified, it recorded what information was retrieved, and it recorded the final generation, and the amount of time each of those steps took. So when something didn't work out, we didn't have to just wonder, like, what was the source of the error? We could go in and see, well, it classified it right, and it actually retrieved all of the right information, but the final model just said totally the wrong thing. So we know there's something wrong in the final prompt. Or on the other hand, it completely misclassified the intent of the question. And because of that, this question about sessions was resulted in retrieving data about the expo or something. So the final model never even had a chance to answer it correctly because the retrieval system failed. So having this sort of separation of concerns was useful both for iterating quickly, but also for isolating where things went wrong as we were iterating on the model.
Nice. Yeah, that's really cool. That bit where you get to see in the traces from a debugging standpoint, that's huge. Did you feel that the amount of data that was being collected through the tracing was challenging in terms of just like, are you drinking from the fire hose in terms of too much log data? Was there anything about like dealing with the tracing data that was like challenging around quantity?
I think you should answer this one, Nick, because you were the one mostly watching it live during the conference itself.
Actually, I mean, both yes and no. I guess we didn't have, millions of users. So we had close to 7,000 messages or conversations rather in total, which was actually a pretty manageable number. That's over the course of a week. So the data size and like sifting through and looking at the traces wasn't really too bad or challenging. In fact, the interfaces that exist in MLflow and in the Databricks version of it are quite good, and I think we were really pleased with those. The challenging part really came from mistakes that we made. So, or I don't know if it's a mistake, but we made a choice to collect the experiments in a certain way. In retrospect, the way that we chose, which was kind of, I mean, it's in the weeds, but essentially you have to create like a new experiment for every build and every version of the bot. And so we would have traces that were spread out across many different experiments. I might even be using the wrong terminology. Or experiments, runs, all whatever. There's a whole hierarchy of a way of doing it, and the way that we happened to choose presented a challenge because it was disparate, it was all over the place, and so we had to also write code to kind of coalesce it, put it all together, and view it in like a global way. So those are the pains that you don't really know until you make the mistake. In hindsight, if we chosen the other way, it would have been easier. So those kinds of things. But on the whole, it was a really good experience. So self-inflicted wounds. It's not really the technology, I would say,
Right.
that got in our way.
Hey, I was thinking about one of the other interesting bits that both from the standpoint of like being able to see in the debugging and also became like a really sort of big topic for us, which was the nature of how we ended up doing retrieval. And just about everybody who ends up like talking about compound AI systems and ended up talking about like wanting to do retrieval for getting context, getting documents that are going to have the right information for generating responses. Like the first thing that just about everybody thinks is like they're going to be doing semantic search, and I mean I'm always sort of like setting up like that turns out to be like a great first conversational starter, but like what else is possible? But Dan, since you were like at the center of like what happened there, you want to dig in on like what we found about like doing search and retrieval for the context?
Yeah, absolutely. So it was funny. I kind of went into this with eyes wide open. I don't know how many Twitter threads I've read of people who set up this kind of application, and they talk about, well, we started with semantic search and our, first two queries returned great results, and it seemed like this magical thing that just solves everything with minimal manual intervention. But then we got a little bit farther into it and it was terrible, and it overall like couldn't handle the majority of question types we needed to use. So then we like kind of used the hybrid search, and eventually we made our way all the way to a keyword search-based approach, and then things were working better. When we started out, we were also using a fully semantic search-based approach. So we vectorized all of our chunks of information. We were using cosine search, cosine similarity to retrieve information. And we found time and time again that this just failed to get the correct information. And it kind of makes sense. Like when we were asking questions about sessions, we might ask like, what talks is a certain speaker given? That's not necessarily something that semantic search is great for. Or a lot of the questions people might ask would be about the specific names of technologies, like what are the talks about Delta or about Unity Catalog or something like that. This again, it's not necessarily the area where semantic search shines. It is actually the area where keyword search shines, because there's kind of a limited list of specific topics, specific technologies, specific speakers that people might be asking about. So eventually we kind of got to the point where we realized like we need to fix this retrieval system, or we're not going to be able to go forward with this. Like this is make or break. We need to make this work. So we totally scrapped semantic search, built a keyword-based system. We used BM25. I don't remember exactly which Python library we used for that, but we used a Python library. We built in some custom enhancements to make it work better. So we built a fuzzy search system to match user queries against the specific list of speaker names. So for example, if somebody asked about a speaker named Matt when they're listed as Matthew, we wanted to make sure that we correctly identified that speaker. So we used fuzzy search to match against our known list of speakers. We also used a query rewriting approach, which also used LLMs in order to come up with a very good query for a keyword-based search system. So what are the talks on Delta Lake isn't necessarily the most useful search, but Delta Lake itself as a term is actually a very good query for BM25 when we're looking at the list of topics available in the sessions. So we sort of use this like enhanced BM25 keyword search with query rewriting and some fuzzy text matching, and found that that was incredibly successful. Assuming that we got the classification of the type of question right, this almost always returned relevant results.
Nice, nice. It's fantastic. And in particular, that bit where even the query rewriting is something that you can actually pull in a language model to do. It so many times in these kind of application situations, there's a question of like, are we just, being a hammer and trying to apply like the hammer as the only thing, so every problem is a nail kind of like mentality to it. But actually in this case, like language models were actually really very good at helping with each of the steps that we found ourselves going, okay, well, we need some help here with the language model in this part, and then that's going to help us get over that particular hurdle. So like tightening up the queries and doing the query writing that way. That the language models were really good at that. I thought was kind of gratifying, just because again, like understanding, there's a lot of hype in this space where you see somebody like, okay, great, I'm going to go run off and grab a given library, whether it's, LangChain or Llama Index or something like that. And that library is going to sort of like take care of making the right thing happen for me. I think that in some ways, of course, that is kind of like the value proposition of that library. It makes it easy for people to engage these tools. But sometimes I think that the part where we end up missing is the part where we understand why it is useful to engage these tools this way. So I loved sort of seeing how query rewriting ended up becoming a part of our application, because of the fact that it showed like this is how you're going to literally make this important delta in terms of like the quality of the responses that you get back and the relevance of the data that comes back. And I have to admit that like personally, it was like, again, sort of like a new read on actually seeing that be effective. It's one thing, again, like I said, like, you watch people get just so so enamored with using language models to do like whatever, that they just sort of like kind of forget, like, by the way, if you just do a relatively simple task like this way, it's much easier to write and it's much more reliable. Why are we bothering to pull in LLM? In this case, it was really clearly like the right tool for the job. So that was great.
Yeah.
I'm feeling like we've probably got to the place where we need to sort of like pick at like some good like closing ideas, like thoughts, things that we want to say, like, what are you excited about for next time, or what are you excited about like being in the Databricks platform that's going to be like really cool for people to work with applications like this going forward. So for each of you, take a moment and think about like whether it's a Databricks feature that's going to make application development for apps like this become something that's really attractable for more people, or if it's just features for next time that are really exciting. I want to just like find a closing button for each of you. So like your top thing for like next time, whether it's product platform or whether it's just like our own app. What's your top one? Nick, why don't you go first?
Well, I have a third category if you
Go for it.
so if I'm not limited to just those two. And it's kind of an extension of what Dan was just expanding on. The thing that definitely excites me for like whatever next year or for the general future is actually the ecosystem of the open models. So I don't think we like explicitly called it out, but we did build this with the prerequisite that we are going to use these open models, and that we would do our best to avoid using the closed, like all the closed models. So that was a pretty conscious decision, and what that meant was, um, I think people who are used to the chat GPTs of the world like actually forget this, but like we were working with limited context length, like very limited actually. And so that means that you can accomplish a lot less like in context stuff. So search is actually one of those things. We experimented with like just blasting ChatGPT with like the list of speakers, and it actually did an amazing job of like, even if you misspelt Matt, it would still find you, Matt, as a speaker. And those are the things that like you have to go and implement yourself, and like, hey, the model does this for you. But that became an intractable thing to do with the open models because the limited context length means we have to do all this work. So the thing that I'm definitely excited for is like, okay, what is the open ecosystem going to look like in a year? And how much of what we did can we just like toss out one day? Because in it, that's like, I mean, I think that's the goal, right? Like, how much is like this in context stuff going to improve and expand to the point where, you know, we don't have to muck around with the, you know, independent things and rewrite this and rewrite that. Like, it just, you know, the context length is big enough to handle, and the tokens are cheap enough to support that, and both price and performance, of course. So I think that's the thing I'm most excited for. Like, how much of everything that we experience is not going to be even a problem in a year from now. That's like the biggest thing I'm looking forward to. Yeah.
That's a huge point, and that sounds like a lot of fun. Dan, what comes to mind for you?
I keep thinking about how we used MLflow traces and how much that enabled in the current iteration. One of the big sacrifices that we did have to make, given the really truncated timeline that we had working on this, I think we had about 8 weeks with 2 of us working part-time on this, really. And MLflow traces was the primary tool that gave us a lot of visibility, as I said, into what was happening at each of those steps. And it was a very new addition to MLflow. I really look forward to building this out with quite a bit more time and resources in the future, and really being able to bring the full suite of evaluation tools, both within MLflow and in Databricks more broadly, to bear on this problem, so that we can do just some much more sophisticated and detailed evaluations, to really get a lot more specific about what we consider the success criteria to be, what we consider great responses to be, and then being able to incrementally work toward them by having these great evaluations that actually reflect what we're going for, instead of having this slightly more informal, case-by-case, vibes-based approach.
That makes a lot of sense. An evaluation set that has those bits, that would be obviously huge, you know, getting the place where we have like a really good way to evaluate. Also, and for the sake of this conversation, it's really kind of like super great to have in front of us. Intrinsically, the bar is going to be a lot higher next time. We've done something that worked. People are gonna be like, okay, let's see what you can really do. You know what I mean? Like the next step is going to be not just like, does it work well for what it did this time, but like, what else can it do? How much more can it do, and for how many more people, in what ways? You know, so the greater usefulness, and the greater scope are definitely coming. So, you know, a good point about like us needing like great evals to go along with that, to make sure that we can actually test and continue to iterate in a way that's going to really be good.
That does remind me of one more.
It,
I should speak to the actual user experience and not just have both of us give like technical developer-centric answers. We really do want it to be a lot more integrated into the conference experience next year. We want it to have access to more information, possibly including like if you're a logged in user in the app and you have a schedule, maybe it would be great if Brickbot could access that schedule and give you much more personalized and tailored information, more integrated with the talks if it has access to, for example, transcripts of the talks, or just generally more details. As it was kind of isolated. It only had access to the specific data that it could retrieve that we gave it, that wasn't live, wasn't real time, wasn't personalized. And I think this will be a lot more useful and exciting if it is more integrated into the conference experience, into the mobile app, etc.
yeah.
Totally. Makes,
And
yes.
that speaks also to like the platform features that you asked about, Kobe. Like, to accomplish that, so I guess the starting point there is, as Dan said, it was an isolated application. It basically had a static data set. It was tiny, and it ran standalone, so it didn't really need any external platforms besides the external calls to the LLMs. But to facilitate like the real-time stuff and these integrations, that is where kind of like a live vector search instance is required. You know, an external table that, you know, is populated with transcripts in real time and indexed by the vector search in real time. And then so suddenly the application kind of sprawls into like, okay, this is much bigger and requires all those tools. So I think we're really excited to use those things, you know, in the next year. And that will be kind of like the full breadth of the Databricks platform will allow us to accomplish that. So yeah, that part's really exciting.
Yeah, right on. All right, let's wrap it up and close it out. Yeah, I'm really excited about what we're going to do next. This has been a lot of fun, and it's only going to get better from here. So maybe we'll be talking about not 8 weeks and 2 developers next time. Maybe we'll be talking about, oh, who knows, 10 weeks and maybe 3. Knowing how things go around here, that's actually probably scarily realistic. But it's still
we did have 3. We did have 3. All the front end stuff was done with basically ChatGPT. So.
Ah.